What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Max.
This is Joey.
And on today's episode, we've got a freaking sweet topic. I'm actually super excited about it, dude.
I'm excited about it too. Very important topic.
We're going to be talking about materialism and its relationship to science and also to philosophy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And to kind of enter into this discussion, we're going to be relying on an article to some extent, as well as several other sources as we do on this podcast. But Joey, look, we need you to do.
I don't know how this became my job.
What you do.
Probably just because I'm
a great salesman.
Decent at it. I don't know. Anyways, welcome to Logos Podcast. Thank you for coming. Max and I are two Roman Catholic seminarians studying to be priests, and we're super pumped to do this podcast. The goal is to introduce you to the beauty and the richness and the truth of the Catholic intellectual and spiritual tradition, and hopefully to introduce you to the Logos himself, who is Jesus Christ. So welcome. Thanks for coming and listening to us. To those of you who are not new to the Logos podcast, welcome to you as well. For all of you, you can support Logos if you like what we're doing, if you're taking good things away from our project, by following us on Instagram, TikTok. We have a YouTube page. You can like our stuff, subscribe to us, write reviews for us. We also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/Logos podcast. You can become a monthly donor to our project and help us continue doing what we're doing. Again, it's still Lent. It's still Lent. If you need
It's a great time to give.
Almsgiving, you could give to Logos podcast, and that would be greatly appreciated. But we're praying for all of you, our listeners, and we're doing this for you. So we're glad you're here.
Yeah.
Did I skip anything? Is there anything I need?
Obviously, always the website. Guys, we'll link this below. You're probably tired of hearing this.
Yeah.
But we'll link all this below.
Yeah.
If we miss anything, it'll be linked below. So there it is.
Dude, how are you doing?
Bro, I'm actually doing really well. Thanks be to God. It's been a good day. We just got done with a break. I know you're not at seminary, so you don't really get those, right?
Yeah.
We just had I guess you could say a 5-day break if you
Spring
include
break.
the week. Yeah, a little bit of a little foretaste of heaven, if you will, right? From our work, and so it was good. I was able to chill, to read, to pray, to also work on some logo stuff that I've fallen behind on, some logistical stuff, and kind of keep you up to date on some of these things. And so it's been groovy, dude. Family seems to be doing well. I always love when I can read some good literature and pray. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good time.
It's inner monk.
I did have a break too.
Oh, yeah?
But it was because
Yeah, tell a crowd, dude.
Well, last podcast that we recorded with Father Dylan James on transgenderism, I was not feeling well during the episode. And then later that day, I started feeling worse and worse, ended up having a terrible stomach infection, had to go to the hospital, get a bunch of medication, and spent the next 4 days resting and recuperating at home, which actually was really needed and very restful time. Doing better now. But it was a good Lenten penance to offer in reparation for all my sins.
It's a lot of them.
A lot of sins that hopefully I atoned for some of them.
So here's what we gather from this event, Joey. Joey is known for eating pretty healthy, right? And I don't, for the most part. Sometimes I do. I try to watch what I eat. But this proves to me that my Taco Bell runs and an occasional barbecue and ice cream runs are justified, because I've never, at least not yet, have been to the hospital with some sort of weird stomach for overnight. And
I don't know what caused it. I'm doubting.
So don't eat spinach, don't eat broccoli, and eat Taco Bell.
I will say that Max, as a good friend and as a good Christian, carried out his corporal work of mercy of visiting the sick. So one of those days that I was home, he came and visited me and got his butt kicked in a game of Scrabble.
You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to do that.
Which was good.
Unnecessary, Joey.
But then did point out to me that my healthy food has landed me in the hospital, and your tacos have landed you really in pristine conditions.
No. I didn't say pristine condition. It's not I wake up in the morning, I'm like, that is not pristine condition, right? But it certainly did not send me to the hospital.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So. Oh, dude, I got a couple stories for you.
You got to tell me some stories.
So actually, I got a story for you, and I have a very serious question.
Okay.
First,
the
story.
The story.
So, sorry, I'm gonna crack up this whole time. I woke up the other morning. It was a daisy morning. Woke up, birds chirping at a distance.
Wow.
The sun shining in my face.
I feel like I'm there.
Well, bear with me. Dude, I go over to my Keurig, right?
Yeah.
It's my morning ritual. Get up, stretch, get a little glass of water, get my Keurig going, right? And it's weird because I do this thing where I brush my teeth first and then drink coffee and then brush my teeth again, whatever.
That is weird.
Okay. But anyways, I go over to my Keurig and I put my coffee mug. What I thought I did was put my coffee mug, get the pod in the thing, press the button, get it brewing. Naturally. I go over to my Keurig, no coffee mug, whole lot of coffee everywhere.
So I was it just spilled out all over the room.
And the way that I have my Keurig set up is that it's on like the top bookshelf of this four stage bookshelf.
Oh,
and
yeah, I know it.
Books all over the bottom piece, right? So all I see is like droplets on the front end of the bookshelf, and so I'm cleaning that up or whatever. What I don't see is a lot of that coffee is drooping through the back end of that shelf, and so all these books are getting ruined.
Library books.
A library book. Some of them are library, some of them are personal books, which still hurts, okay? And I don't notice until yesterday when I pick out a book to read it, and it's like crusty and yellow and brown. Anyways.
That's what you get for brushing your teeth before drinking a cup of coffee.
Dude, honestly, that's fair. I think about that. I was like, you're a maniac, Max.
Also, I mean, I shared the story about my difficulties making. We're not doing well. Logos, we struggle with coffee. I've stopped drinking coffee completely. I don't like it anymore.
Poor guy.
Mostly because I don't know how to make a cup.
That's fair.
All right, what's the question?
Serious question.
Yeah.
Do you think kangaroos are rideable? Do you think you can domesticate a kangaroo? Me and another guy in seminary were having this discussion. You know, horses are naturally wild animals.
It's true.
They've been domesticated, saddled, and to be ridden. Kangaroos, on the other hand,
on a kangaroo,
haven't been tested. Now, here's some more facts. Big facts for you. No printer. They can get up to 200 pounds. Up to 200 pounds.
This is what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, I'm almost 200 pounds.
Okay.
So I don't think I could ride one.
You could probably piggyback ride me for a while. Okay, also listen to this.
I think they could be domesticated. I don't think you could ride one.
Also, they can get up to 8 pounds. So if it's a matter of logistical carrying of the weight, I think they can do it.
They can get up to 8 pounds?
8 feet. Sorry.
8 feet tall.
8 feet, yeah. So they can get up to 8 feet tall and up to 200 pounds. So I just want to lay it out there as a possibility, and I want you to even pray about it.
I will. I'll take it to I'll discern it.
Nice.
What I'll do is I have this dream of being able to be a priest at a parish where I can just ride my bike everywhere and not a car. I don't think it's ever going to happen.
Now
but
you
maybe
can ride
now I'll ride my kangaroo.
Exactly. I'm just saying, throwing it out there. What do you think, listener? I think it's a great question.
I think we should maybe make a poll on Instagram or something like that.
I think we should.
Speaking of kangaroos, they're made of matter.
Joey.
We should talk about materialism.
Yeah. They are material beings.
Okay, why are we talking about materialism other than the fact that we read this good article and it prompted this conversation? Why is materialism
I really
relevant?
don't want to talk about this, Joey, so you tell me.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Why are we? Tell me, Joey. Leadeth me.
Okay, well, as a lot of the philosophical topics we talk about are, this philosophy is very prevalent in modern society.
Sure.
And I think it's even prevalent in the minds of Christians. Probably unconsciously. We're fed a materialistic worldview, which is basically the worldview that everything is matter, right?
Yeah.
And so that's really why we want to address it, because we think this philosophy is problematic.
Yeah.
It's contrary to the gospel at the end of the day, and contrary to reason as well.
Sure.
That we're gonna try to show that. So that's why I'm motivated to talk about this topic.
Yeah, and I think that historically, materialism has caused a lot of terrible things to happen. I think, as you're saying, it underpinning materialism is a really kind of deprivation in encountering reality, the dignity of man, and love. Right.
Yeah, it leads to a degradation of these things.
Right,
if it's followed to its logical conclusions.
Right, and it can really kind of hurt people.
Yeah.
You know? And I think oftentimes we use this phraseology, this person is a materialist, right? In common parlance, we may just say, this person is a materialist.
Materialistic.
Right, materialistic. And we're oftentimes just saying, this person loves leather and loves very expensive cars.
Likes things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he likes having, the nicest whatever phone.
Right.
And so many of us kind of say these things just kind of nonchalantly, but materialism is a serious idea, and that
might be influencing the person who lives their life totally for buying things.
Right, exactly.
And, but they might not know the explicit philosophy.
Yeah, and the kind of logical conclusion that such an idea actually lends itself towards. And so that's, I think, part of it. It's like there's this kind of common use of the word. We don't know what it means.
Yeah.
And part of our endeavor here is to kind of illuminate what these concepts that we oftentimes use philosophically.
That's a good point.
mean. So part of it, obviously, it's like this huge influence on the culture. And I think that's really
okay. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna briefly define materialism. Then we're gonna do a historical overview of the development of this philosophy.
Yep.
And then we're going to talk about this article that we read that we found pretty helpful. So that's kind of the roadmap for this episode.
Sure.
So first, there are scientists and there are materialists.
Yeah.
Sometimes scientists are materialists, but that's not necessary. So like, what is science and then what is materialism? How are they distinct from each other?
Okay. So let's start with science here.
Okay.
Let's define science first. Just succinctly. We're not going to get all into the details of what science, there's huge literature, there's a lot of literature and amount of research done in this field. But succinctly, science is the branch of knowledge that investigates the structure and behavior of the natural world by observation and experimentation. In other words, science takes matter seriously. Science takes the material world, investigates it, and tries to give a rational explanation for the phenomenon that's taking place in this natural world.
This, when we say science, I mean these are the natural sciences, right? The hard sciences.
The hard science,
biology, chemistry, physics, these things.
Sure.
But yeah, exactly. It's this organized body of knowledge that proceeds from observation of the material empirical world.
And science as we know it today didn't really take on its form until about the 17th century.
With
up
Francis
until then,
Bacon, right?
With Francis Bacon and the scientific revolution.
We'll get into that. Okay, so that's science.
Right.
So what is materialism then?
Okay, so materialism is a philosophy that asserts that being in existence is identified by matter.
So everything is matter.
Everything is matter, right? And so positively we can say, okay, the materialist holds the fact that reality itself is explainable through the material world.
Through only matter, yeah.
Negatively, however, we could say materialism is saying that's the only explanation for reality, right? That's it.
Yeah.
Now, its relationship to science is interesting because while not every scientist is strictly speaking a materialist, and I think that's an important qualification, there is a deep relationship between the two that we've seen time and time again, which we'll lay out here shortly, right? But science takes this matter, in a lot of ways takes this philosophy and applies it to its observational method.
Yeah, so this is important. So if you're a scientist, you have to kind of carry out the scientific endeavor like a materialist.
Sure.
And what I mean by that is you have to bracket everything except your empirical observation of the material world.
In order to try to be objective.
In order to be a scientist, in order to be an objective scientist. What a lot of scientists will do, and we see this, and we'll talk about this in our article, is that they'll take their observations from their scientific endeavor and they'll add into those observations a philosophical position. Namely the philosophical position of materialism.
Yeah.
So they'll use the scientific process to discover truths about the material world, which again is good and like necessary and has borne so much fruit in the world, right? And has allowed us to understand nature in such a profound way. But then the problem that a lot of scientists make, even unconsciously, is to then jump to the conclusion, the philosophical, not scientific conclusion, but the philosophical conclusion, okay, that this material phenomenon is actually all that there is.
Yeah.
And that reality is reducible to the matter that I see in front of me, that I can explain everything in terms of matter. That's materialism, and that is
scientism taken to its extremity.
Exactly.
Right.
So, and we did an episode on scientism that you can go listen to for sure, but that's kind of, and we're going to see why that's problematic. So turns out that materialism is not a new idea, even though it's super prevalent in our society.
No.
So let's talk about the development of this idea, and it goes back a really long way. So can you help us walk through some of the history of this philosophy?
Yeah, so I want to give kind of a brief historical sketch of materialism. Bear with me, guys. This is going to be kind of dense, but the idea of sketching this history out is to kind of point to the gravity of this philosophy that is now taking hold of the culture in a lot of ways. So we're just kind of pointing to the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot of layers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I want to kind of, if you will, show some of that layer, some of that baggage even that has to do with materialism. So again, bear with me. in order to kind of make the discussion bearable and easy, I'm going to split this up into 4 different kind of historical periods
right? Yeah.
where materialism has kind of manifested and made itself known. And throughout these historical periods, science also creeps its way in, and its relationship with science will kind of be intermingled throughout there.
What are the 4 periods? There's ancient philosophy,
medieval,
the medieval period,
right? Modern,
the modern period, and
then what we're calling contemporary.
So
right,
like 21st century, like guys who are still around today, thinking today.
Correct. Okay, so the first one, the ancient historical period. This time frame scopes from about the 7th century BC to the 5th century AD, more or less.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's a lot of these guys before Jesus, before Christianity.
Right. This is like kind of the Hellenistic period.
Greek philosophers.
Pre-Socratics. All this is encompassed. And we're not going to get into all the minutiae of breaking down the subcategories.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Actually,
I wish I could, but Joey stopped me.
Yeah.
That's okay. Good. The important thing to keep in mind here with the ancients is that they took the material world seriously, but they also took their faith serious. Their belief was pantheistic, which is to say that God was deeply connected with the natural world, right? And that God is present in and through other people and through matter.
So there was like a god of thunder or like a god of the rain or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they personified these in their Greek myths.
Right.
But they were still grappling with the material
Iliad,
world.
Odyssey, all this was kind of that idea. But the first kind of, and the reason that the ancient philosophers are important is because this is kind of the first formal branch of what we call materialism, right? And the first figure to kind of launch this idea off is Thales of Miletus. If you want to look him up, do so.
Thales.
That's a pretty sweet name.
I'd name a son Thales.
Right? Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I was going to have children.
But you're not.
All right.
Biological.
I'm not thinking of it.
Good.
Okay.
Let it go.
All right.
Stop. All right, good. All right. Thales of Miletus is around the 6th century BC. And his thing was like all is water. And it sounds kind of radical and crazy. But think about kind of walk in their shoes. There is no calculator.
Right.
There is no ruler. There is
microscope.
no philosophy is just in a certain way getting started.
It's actually a pretty sophisticated. He said literally his idea was that everything in its most fundamental elements is made up of water.
Right.
Which is not, I mean, we're made up of a lot of water. Water makes up like a lot of the so that was kind of his thing. Right.
But then you also had others within this ancient philosophy that kind of, again, hyper-focused on the material reality. You had Heraclitus, all this fire. You had Anaximenes, all this wind. Anaxagoras, the mind kind of informs reality. That's a little more right, but again, not necessarily, exactly the way we would see it. And so that's kind of the start of materialism.
These are ancient philosophers who are looking to describe reality in terms of one of its material parts.
Right.
Either water or fire,
earth, air.
One of the elements.
Wind, and fire. That's when the album came out, actually.
4th century BC.
4th century. It's right. Lionel Richie coming hot with his mustache. You know what I mean?
That's right.
Okay. And then you also have another branch within this ancient period called the atomists.
This is interesting.
This is very interesting. I remember in Intro to Philosophy when we were talking about these guys, the atomists were started by 2 men, Leucippus and Democritus. Again, if you want to research them, do so. Do it, whatever. Their big thing is that everything is composed of what they call the indivisible chunks of matter. Which
familiar.
Interact. Yes, exactly. They interact in empty space so as to produce what we call reality.
Yeah.
Right? So there's these little particles.
Indivisible.
Tiny little things. You can continue splitting up in their mind, right, onto infinity. But there's the tiny particles kind of hitting each other and causing about what we call the cosmos, what we call reality, what we call existence, being. Sound familiar?
Yeah, so when I learned this surprised me too, that even in like the 3rd century BC, people were proposing the idea of atoms. Right, which eventually later got adopted again in the modern period, which we'll talk about. But then, like now that turns out that in a lot of ways that was correct.
Right.
That the material world as we know it is made up of these indivisible kind of fundamental parts. But these guys were talking about that all the way back then.
Then you also have somebody named Epicurus, and his major contribution is that he used the material world to try to explain the providence of God and the will of God. Which again, here you see this connection between an attempt to kind of come in contact with a deity through the material investigation that they were given, right? And so that's kind of the major contribution there. I'm not saying this guy's unimportant, or the reason I'm skipping some names is because for the sake
you
of
don't know him
discussion.
anyway.
Yeah, that's also true. I don't, actually, to be fair. And also just kind of sprinkled in here, I wanted to throw in St. Augustine.
Yeah, so he's 3rd century,
3rd,
4th
4th century, right?
AD, yeah.
Right, and he fell into the sect called Manichaeism.
Yeah, before his conversion to Christianity, he was a Manichaean.
He was a Manichaean. And the reason I think that's significant is because he would have come in contact with some of these materialistic ideas because he studied in Rome, you know? And so he would have had some exposure to these ideas in the academic circles, he himself taking up something actually against the materialistic view. Manichaeans denied the significance of the material reality, right? They had this dualistic view. There's kind of the human material nature and there's their spiritual supernatural world.
The matter that there's a good God and there's a bad God. The good God produces spiritual things, and the bad God is responsible for material things. Right. And so, like, the good life is fleeing from matter and the material world towards the things of the spirit.
Correct. All right.
Which again, we don't, as Christians, that's incorrect as well. And
he retracted that belief.
He later, when he converted to Christianity, realized that was not correct.
Okay. Cool. So
those are some of the ancients.
Right.
Okay.
Let's move on to the medieval.
Okay.
This is a bit easier, but still nuanced. The medieval period stretches from the 6th century to about the 16th century. Cool?
Big period of time.
Big period, big chunk of time. So I'm not going to do this justice at all. Again. But this period moves away from a focus on the material world, okay, onto a more kind of ontological, if you will, and spiritual focus of reality. Okay, there's a more emphasis on like the soul
and on the mind,
on the essence.
And this is greatly influenced by the writings of guys like Plato and Aristotle, right?
Right. So Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Bonaventure, St. Thomas Aquinas. I mean, all of these guys were there. But to address the kind of elephant in the room, why are we talking about Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle? Aren't those guys ancients? They are, but their works were just being translated around this time period.
And becoming accessible to the Western world.
Exactly.
In the medieval period.
And so all of a sudden you have this kind of move away from this hyper focus on matter to the importance of the soul, again, nature, essence, the mind.
So
soul.
It's interesting. Plato, he had his theory of the forms.
Yeah.
So whereas all the ancient philosophers were trying to explain reality in terms of its material parts, like water, fire, whatever it might have been, or atoms, Plato says, no, actually there's this realm of the forms, this immaterial reality where the universal truths, the universal, like the good, or like the form of the beautiful, or the form of justice exist. And that is actually the real world. Yeah. And this material reality, it's kind of dualistic, Manichaeanistic in that sense, but the material world is just a shadow. It's just a faint image of the real world. And so that's a complete switch, like in the thought of Plato, like now the immaterial world is primary. But then you have Aristotle, who's like, what he does is he talks about the forms not existing in some immaterial realm, but the form of a thing actually existing
with the thing,
within the thing itself. So what do I mean by that? Human nature, there's this thing that we see called human nature that's observable in every human being. Right. Plato would have said something like, the reason that we can identify human nature in every human being is because in this immaterial realm, there's this form of human nature. Right. There's this form of humanness.
It's kind of an ideal.
An ideal, exactly. Yeah. It's kind of in the mind of God, if you could think about it like that. And all of us participate somehow in that form, in that immaterial form. Ideal, right. And when when our soul finally escapes this body and enters the realm of the forms, we'll be able to see reality for what it is. Aristotle rejects that idea. He says, no, I'm not going to be an idealist like that. Actually, there is something real called human nature, but it doesn't exist in this immaterial realm that we don't have access to. Right. Human nature exists. It inheres in the particular instantiations of a human being.
Which encompasses the soul.
Right. So, and he would say, basically, so the material world as we see it and interact with it is informed by these forms, right? It is united to these, for an example, in a human being would be something like a body and a soul, right? So the human person, the human being, is made up of, yes, a body that's observable and empirical, but that whole body is only intelligible and only carries out its proper functions because it's being informed and animated by an immaterial soul, right? And this is what we call hylomorphism, this unity of soul and body. We talked about this with Father James.
We talked about it throughout our channel,
but this is, I mean, just to lay the groundwork before we continue through the medieval and modern and contemporary periods, it's like, this is actually, with the help of people like St. Thomas Aquinas, the philosophy, the philosophical anthropology that the church has adopted in its correct understanding, that the human being, the reality, it's not primarily material, it's not primarily immaterial, and we have to escape from the matter somehow, but reality is
sacramental.
Exactly.
That would be the word.
It's a visible manifestation of the immaterial. Right? So, okay, cool.
Okay, and so what do we have here? A move away from the hyper-focus on matter onto these, as
in the
Joey's
medieval period,
about, right, in the medieval period. I think importantly to note too is that the church is also emphasizing the importance of the soul, the importance of nature
during this time.
Right? So we're kind of laying it out academically, if you will,
right.
But obviously there's a lot of implications here. But interestingly enough, later in this medieval period, you have kind of this scientific movement going on, kind of creeping in through the back curtain, if you want to get dramatic with it. You have thinkers like Copernicus come about, right? His heliocentrism versus geocentrism, right? Yeah. Then you have Francis Bacon with his pivotal work, Principia Mathematica, right?
Which started the scientific method.
Right, the principles of math, right? And they were kind of like the first laws of motion were set into play there. Then you also have Galileo.
Oh, that was Isaac Newton, Principia Mathematica.
Okay, was that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so my point being here that's like, okay, you're right. But there's science kind of in the background coming about. Again, never without some kind of utterance throughout time, but really taking shape here, really taking mold here.
Yeah, this is the beginning of the scientific revolution, right? Here in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, all these developments are taking place.
And just to emphasize a point that we made earlier, these people were not a-religious.
Yeah.
Isaac Newton was not. Francis Bacon was not. Copernicus was not. Galileo was not.
They were Christians,
right?
Many of them,
and Isaac Newton particularly has a lot of writings reflecting on kind of a theological view of the world. Again, and I say all that to say that as you were moving away from this hyper-focus in the medieval age on matter, there's also a scientific kind of world.
Yeah, and growing. So even though these scientists, these kind of pioneers of the scientific revolution, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, even though they themselves were not strictly speaking materialists, they admitted the existence of immaterial reality. Many of them did. Their writings and their methods paved the way for modern materialists, right? So up until Francis Bacon, when someone said philosophy, that encompassed what we think of as science, as like the investigation of the material world. So science and philosophy were not distinct things. But when Francis Bacon introduced his scientific method, now instead of just this one broad category of philosophy in which we thought about nature and first principles, now we have this meticulous empirical way of observing the physical material universe, right, through the scientific method. And that becomes distinct from the rest of philosophy, which is thinking about reason, thinking about nature, thinking about these immaterial, thinking about the soul. So here with Francis Bacon, we have this divide between the two, and which is going to become significant.
And also, I think importantly to just reemphasize your point, I mean, the Copernican revolution implied a lot of things, even for example, the liturgical life of the church.
Yeah, right? That's a whole...
exactly. In Galileo, like the propositions they had about the cosmological order implied a lot of things, right? More than just, oh, that's cool, let's just reshape our maps here and throw them away. Like there's a whole system of society that has been shaped around a particular view. And there takes time to integrate our emerging views into that system, if you will, right? And so, as Joey's saying here, there's a lot taking place in the background here. Yeah. Again, we're not doing this justice, but just to lay out materialism and science kind of coming about here. Then the Enlightenment is kind of brewing in the background, again, led by people like Galileo, Isaac Newton, and the sorts, which tended in a kind of rationalistic and deeply materialistic lens. Again, none of these were strictly speaking materialistic, but there was tendencies in that direction. And also, I dare say, atheistic tendencies. And particularly when the Enlightenment period was kind of launched into popular culture by the French Revolution. Right? So a little bit of the historical context.
And the spirit of the Enlightenment was that man can now understand everything and eventually will be able to conquer everything through the use of his reason.
Right.
So now, and because of that, great things did come about out of the Enlightenments. Like, again, advances in science, advances in political philosophy, but man was so confident in his reason and thought that in principle he could explain everything about the universe using his reason alone. So that was one of the kind of characteristics of the Enlightenment that, again, has led to now the more modern day notion of materialism that we see.
So remember that time when I said this was a simple period? It wasn't. I was kidding.
Yeah.
Also, and kind of lastly in this period, if you will, is the Reformation, which is kind of important because
kind of important.
Yeah, in the sense of like this particular topic, because like people like Martin Luther would have argued that something like philosophy, which takes immateriality, I should say the other way around, something like science cannot explain any historical or biblical truth, because we operate as Christians, in his view, under the scope of what Scripture tells us.
Yeah, so Martin Luther introduces this sola fide, right? Like we're saved by faith alone, right? So in what became the Protestant view is that faith and reason, there's an intrinsic divide between them, which is not the Catholic tradition, which is not true, but that does introduce, again, these mechanisms by which a philosophy like materialism can become prevalent. It's because, starting with the Protestant Reformation, people started to see a natural divide between what I believe to be true about God and things, and then what I know to be true about reality in the material world.
And so, as we've laid out here, there's a deep drama between this dichotomy of faith and reason, if you will, of kind of immateriality and materiality at play, at least a seeming dichotomy between the two, which we're still in large part trying to reconcile with as a church and trying to kind of find our way through and reconcile and integrate the two. And so there's this drama in the medieval age taking place. And then in the modern era, which we would scope from about the 17th century to the 20th century, you have a priest named Father Pierre Gassendi, and he kind of, you look up the name, but his important contribution is that he kind of awoke the ancient beliefs of the materialist. He argued in line with someone like people like the atomists, that the small particles interacting together are what cause about the effects in the world. Right? Again, that sounds familiar, because going back to our conversation on the ancient philosophers, that's what they were arguing for. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, deeply famous, particularly in American literature, would have argued that all sensation is actually explainable by the activity in the brain, by the activity of the matter in the brain, which is also very important. We'll talk on that a lot more here shortly. Keep that in mind, because that's very prevalent in a lot of particularly psychological and neuroscientific investigations.
So Thomas Hobbes says something like, you want to understand the human person in its totality, you can do that in terms of the chemical firings that take place in his brain. Right. You can completely explain
it. And then it's Big Daddy René Descartes.
Mi favorito.
Yeah. Big man. He's coined as the father of modern philosophy, and his big contribution to this discussion particularly is, and his most significant, and is kind of the principle of modern philosophy, is this great divide, this dualistic divide between the mind and matter.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that is big time when we're talking about here, again, the soul, the experience, reason, consciousness, and the material world and scientific investigation. Then within this period, you also have the Industrial Revolution. What? Industrial Revolution, what is it promoting? Let's produce more, let's make more, let's work more, and let's make money. And things that make money are the things we should hold as highest values in society. Right?
Yeah.
And this is also important, just like kind of a brief note, this is also when you start having a huge downgrade in liberal arts and the importance that they play in education, all these things, because they're not making money, turns out, right now.
They're not productive.
They're not productive. They're not shoveling in coal.
Yeah.
Right? They just want to sit around and smoke cigarettes and drink wine and perform on an empty stage somewhere. So there's a movement against that, a kind of hyper reaction against that. Then, and I think very importantly, we're moving into really kind of the source of this discussion. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, right? These are materialists to the extreme.
So this is,
atheists to the extreme.
Some of the first, real articulations of what we think of today when we think of materialism, right? Karl Marx thinks the soul, God, none of that is real. None of that exists.
And that like everything is explainable through these deep tensions.
And for him, economic class struggle, right?
Right. And so how do we explain reality in the events taking place in history? Well, by the clash taken amidst classes, fighting for this stuff.
There's not some immaterial first cause who's responsible for all being. There's just stuff. There's just there, and it progresses through these laws of economic class struggle.
And in order to be free, you have to get more stuff.
You have to get more stuff, and you have to, in order to save man, you don't have to teach him virtue or help him to refrain from sin or like grow in grace. In order to save man, you have to improve his material conditions of existence. That's salvation for Marx.
Boom.
Which is insufficient.
Yes. And I mean, and this is where it gets kind of ugly, because the materialism is taken up by communism, Nazism, fascism, the Soviet Union, Mussolini, Stalin, Hitler.
Yeah.
Like Karl Marx and his philosophy is deeply interwoven into communism, because if man really is just a compilation of atoms working to exert itself in power economically, and he can be discarded if he's not producing, then really what is man? Then we get to dismantle him, and we get to
then
shoot
it doesn't
him.
matter if we have to, as Lenin said, crack a few eggs to make an omelet.
Exactly.
Right? Like in order to bring about social progress and material improvement, it's okay if we can discard hundreds, thousands, millions of people, because really they don't have any dignity. There's no immaterial value to them. There's no transcendent value. They're just things. They're just objects, material
Small
objects.
particles clashing.
Right.
Okay. So we've laid out the modern realm. Let's get to our last realm here, period in history.
Contemporary philosophy, the guys who are living and thinking and writing today.
Right. 21st century onto now. Okay. And this is big time, because this is kind of where our real discussion starts.
Yeah.
Here you have a big movement to what's called eliminative materialism. Eliminative sounds like a big word. It's pretty easy, actually, for all intents and purposes. It seeks to eliminate the commonsensical assumptions and explanations of reality. And it's saying that, well, we hold these views, and we held these views for so long.
Views like... Like love is a real thing, or like meaning and beauty and truth. These are real values, right? These people would say, these materialists, these eliminative materialists would say, those things are like commonsensical things that we think exist because of our experience. But really, once we get down to the nitty gritty scientific explanation of it all, we're going to see that those things aren't actually real.
And so that's the thing, right? So like eliminative materialism seeks to remove these assumptions and saying, kind of providing a sense of hope. One day we will, by removing these commonsensical things, we'll be able to see clearly about this next step in man's evolution.
Yeah.
Sort of like we'll be able to see the flat earth.
Right.
You know, it's like we saw the flat earth and we're laughing at it now. Same thing that'll happen here. Kind of.
Yeah, like 200 years from now, we'll look back and laugh at the poor humans who thought that like moral values were important, or that like
conscientiousness is important.
Consciousness or God was a real, relevant hypothesis, right? So this is kind of the spirit of the contemporary age.
Right.
And a lot of scientists, a lot of neuroscientists especially. And I think that leads us into the article that we want to talk
100%.
about. So this article, it's called Materialism, the False God of Modern Science. And it's written by this guy named George, I don't even know how you pronounce his name, Stanciu, Stanciu, Stanciu. And he actually has his PhD in theoretical physics, and he's the author of a couple books. But I found this, he explains in this article how he spent the first part of certainly his university days and the first part of his professional career ascribing to the philosophy of materialism.
Sure.
He grew up with no religious background, but then he kind of, throughout the course of studying science and neuroscience in particular, he came to realize that there are holes in this philosophical position of materialism that actually lead one to admit the fact that like immaterial reality is real and actually primary. So I want to read just kind of what he says about his own journey. He says this. So he says, despite my gypsy heritage and my outsider life, I was seduced at an early age by the picture science paints of the world. He says, the beauty of relativity and quantum physics made me a true believer. And he makes this caveat. He says, unless a person is born with the quirky ability to do higher mathematics, it's almost impossible to understand that seeing the beauty of theoretical physics is akin to a mystical experience. So this guy, he saw the beauty of science, of quantum mechanics, of theoretical physics, and he was so enraptured by it that he was like, this has to be all there is.
And many people live under that assumption,
Exactly,
right?
exactly. So he says, at 21, I was convinced that science was the sole path to truth and scoffed at the several people I knew who were studying philosophy, and I made fun of the 2 physics graduate students who attended church regularly. He says, like the vast majority of scientists, I believed religion belonged to the Dark Ages that preceded the Age of Enlightenment. Men and women could only be truly free when they cast off the chains of the past. I thought I had the great advantage of not having a religious upbringing, so I was free from the ridiculous ideas instilled by religious authorities. Right? So this is in many respects the
dichotomy.
The attitude of modern man.
Right. This is the great drama that we've kind of been building in our historical analysis of like, okay, there's this guy who's kind of presenting that in his own life, indeed, this dichotomy is present.
Yeah.
Right.
And so then this is kind of what he says. He says, however, he says, in my quest for the meaning of human life, so when he's asking these deep questions and trying to see if science can actually respond to them adequately, he says, I soon grasped that science is only one path to truths that are not the most interesting part of life, although they are beautiful and surprising. He says, I discovered that all human beings suffer from a fatal intellectual flaw, the propensity to take one truth and make it the only truth. He says, for the vast majority of scientists, science is a new religion, and they refuse, like all true believers, to see that the emperor has no clothes. They close their eyes to the limitations of the experimental method, and they willfully deny that the philosophy of materialism gives silly answers to the most fundamental questions, right? So he comes to the realization later in his life that materialism is insufficient. And we're going to talk about why he says that.
Yeah.
Right? So in the article, he lays out kind of some of the steps along which the path along which he followed in order to come to the realization that materialism is an insufficient philosophy, even by scientific standards.
Right. And we're not going to talk about all of the kind of categories he's laid out. We're going to talk about a few of them that I think highlight what he's talking about. And I think the first thing that we could highlight in here, if you will, Joey, is his recognition that the function in the brain and the kind of neurons interacting in the brain don't actually explain perception.
Yeah. So this is big. So what is a materialist, a scientific materialist would say something like this: the human mind, the human soul is not an immaterial thing. All of the human experience is reducible to the chemical neurons and reactions taking place in the brain. Right. The brain is the mind, or the mind is only the brain. Right. So this is the mantra that he heard his entire life and he just assumed to be true. But then he comes to this recognition in his investigation of modern neuroscience that like actually brain function alone can't explain one of the most basic things that human beings do, namely perceive things.
So just to make this point all the more clear, and many of you listening may hold this assumption, and I in fact did for many, many years of my life until actually about 2 years ago when it struck me that for so long we've been told that the mind is right here in the muscle that we call the brain.
Yeah.
Or we say the heart is right here in the muscle that we call cardiovascular muscle. But in fact, he's saying, no, that's not exactly it.
That the interior life of the human person, even though it's dependent upon the physical structures that make us up, like our brain, like our heart, is actually an immaterial thing.
Right.
And trying to explain it merely in terms of the material components that make us up is radically insufficient and actually scientifically untenable. So, yeah, this is the first thing he says. He says, one seemingly insurmountable obstacle for a neuroscientist intent upon reducing a person to nothing but a pack of neurons is to explain how wiring together 86 billion neurons in the brain can give rise to the love of Mozart's Don Giovanni or to the joy of windsurfing at Malaya Bay in Hawaii, right? So joy, loving, the experience of beauty.
Personhood.
Right, personhood. These things can't be explained by the neural connections that take place in our brain, right? So, the next So this is something he says. He says, brain physiology alone cannot explain the most obvious human experience. We perceive, right? So and he cites this neuroscientist who says, we really have no clear idea how we see anything. This fact usually is concealed from students who take such courses as psychology, physiology, and cell biology of vision. But really, even though we know what happens in the brain when we see something, we don't really know what it means to perceive. Like that can't be explained neurologically.
We don't also know, like, as you mentioned, love. We can't kind of scientifically calculate feelings, right? Or any passion, really.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't have scientific explanations in that realm. And yet we oftentimes, certainly in the scientific field, like to think that all material reality, or I should say the material reality, can explain itself and has its rationale in itself. Let me read to you something that I thought is very interesting, because it talking about this line of sensation and science doesn't explain it.
He's going to try to lay this out a little bit more clearly.
Right. So I want to read you this paragraph. It reads, suppose sunlight is reflected from a red apple into the eye of a landscape painter. The sunlight passes through the lens of the eye and strikes the retina, a sheet of closely packed receptors, 4.5 million cones and 90 million rods. Activated by the incoming sunlight, chemical changes occur in the rods and cones, which are then translated into electrical impulses that travel along the optic nerve to the brain. Further electrical and chemical changes take place in the brain. In terms of physiology of seeing, this description is complete. However, the sensation red has not entered into this scientific account of perception. The landscape painter experiences the red of the apple, not the myriad chemical and electrical changes that are necessary for seeing.
Yeah, I mean, this landscape painter who sees this landscape, sees the red of the apple, his experience is something distinct from, even though it's dependent upon, the chemical process taking place in his brain, right? And this is Aristotle's hylomorphism, right? It's that our mind is an immaterial thing that perceives reality, that encounters it. It's dependent upon the functions of our bodies because we're ensouled bodies. We're embodied souls. We are bodies and souls. We're a composite of body and soul that function together, but are nevertheless distinct realities. So he says this. He says, the sensible qualities a person perceives never appear in the brain as such. So this is helpful to think about. Like, listeners, just take a second to think about this. He says the brain itself is shrouded in complete silence, even while a person hears the deafening roar of a jet engine aircraft. Right? He says, likewise, the brain encased in the skull is covered with darkness, even when a person perceives the brilliance of the sun's glare. So when I see light, my brain isn't like experiencing that light. My brain's in my head, right? He says, our brains do not become colder when we touch snow or harder when we touch iron. Not a single sugar molecule passes from the chocolate candy in the mouth to the gustatory region of the cerebral cortex.
So much nerd language.
And yet we perceive sweetness notwithstanding, right?
I love chocolate. You love chocolate, Joey?
I do love chocolate. My sister, Maggie, she gave up chocolate for Lent.
Oh, yeah, I remember saying that.
Which is pretty impressive because she eats it like every day.
God bless her. Hopefully she goes to heaven for that.
Hopefully she's listening to this and uniting her sufferings to Jesus Christ.
Neuroscience. Let's talk about neuroscience.
But maybe to finish off reading this paragraph, you could read this paragraph right here because I think that sums it up pretty well.
Right. Okay. So, and actually, in fact, right here you have a relationship between kind of science and materialism kind of being presented, which we again talked about throughout the length of this episode. Mechanical, chemical, and electrical changes themselves are not thoughts, desires, and emotions.
Say that again, because this is the thesis of this part of the article.
Mechanical, chemical, and electrical changes themselves are not thoughts, desires, and emotions.
Yeah.
The toolbox of physical science is limited to air pressure, chemical changes, electrical impulses in nerves, brain cell activity, and other measurable properties of matter. So here you see the philosophy that guides science, namely an emphasis and investigation in and through matter and its activity.
That's what science is supposed to do. So the language it has to use is only language that has to do with matter, with chemical changes, but he says science is mute when it comes to things like hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, and touching. And he says the reason is obvious. The interior life of a person is non-material. Perceptions, emotions, and thoughts cannot be touched, smelled, tasted, heard, or seen.
Boom.
Right. So this is the thesis of the article, which I found very convincing, very intriguing. Should we talk about emergentism, or should we just move on to a tour of Beethoven's brain?
I think simply put, we can say that emergentism is this idea that eventually one day the rationale will emerge that will do away with commonsensical, again, antiquated thoughts of philosophy, of the soul, of rationale, of all these things. And eventually amongst us, we will have some perfect explanation of why the material world is, in fact, the one and only explanation for reality itself.
Yeah, so he says a lot of scientists will explain away these problems with our inability to describe, for example, perception in terms of neurobiology by saying that, oh, well, basically this is just an example of emergence in nature. And what emergence is when you get an increasingly complex organism or reality, eventually new qualities are going to appear, like, I don't know, consciousness, perception. And even though we can't explain those now in terms of matter, eventually we're going to be able to. But that's basically, that's an irrational hope based upon this ideological, materialistic worldview.
Right.
Okay, I just want to read this one paragraph from this section that he titled "A Tour of Beethoven's Brain."
What I just want to say, I think it's hilarious and kind of ironic because the musician is now here put juxtaposed to the scientist.
Yeah.
Right. The artist is kind of this idea of like the humanist and the scientist in competition here with Beethoven's brain. Good luck touring this brain.
Let's go on a tour.
Let's do it.
So he says, imagine taking a micro bus touring Beethoven's brain. And he says this, as the microtour bus zips through the brain, he witnesses electron transport, ion interactions, and the furious chemical activity of enzymes within each cell. Nowhere does he see or taste the wine being enjoyed right now by the brain's owner. Even though the tour guide points out particular series of excuse me. So nowhere does he see the wine being enjoyed right now by the brain's owner, even though the tour guide does point out a particular series of electrical impulses that correlate with those sensations. He says nowhere does he see Beethoven's remembrance of his first meeting with Mozart. No emotions are discernible either as you go on this bus tour. You never recognize this particular spatiotemporal pattern of neural activity as anger at having gone deaf, or that complex electrical pattern of nerve cells as joy or fear or despair. So you don't see these things in the brain. You see neurological activity.
But there's also like a level, going back here to the affective, like there's something interior happening in man too.
Right.
That's not accountable in the activity of the brain.
Exactly.
Right. So there's something going on here that is explainable in one sense, and we're not denying that.
Yeah.
Like obviously neuroscientists can tell us something about
it's real.
And
yeah.
It's real, but that's not the only explanation.
It's
to what's
not
going
the complete
on.
picture.
Right. And so to posit that science, particularly the materialist approach to science, that emphasizes that matter is in fact the explainable method for all of reality, that's what we're kind of against. Right.
Yeah. And what's important here though too, based off that point, is that like because a human person is body and soul, the body does play a very important part. So important, in fact, that if the body is harmed in some way, like if someone suffers brain trauma, that is going to affect the ability of the soul to carry out its proper functions, right? Nevertheless, the activity of the mind of the person, the interior life of man, is distinct from the neurochemical processes that make up his brain, right? So I think we've said a decent amount about this article. I'm just going to summarize this last part. He talks about how there still, despite all these facts in science that he's observed, there are still some scientists who hold out, hoping that eventually we'll be able to explain a phenomenon like perception using neuroscience.
Right.
But he says that his thesis is that these are vain hopes that really are irrational, and that a vast majority of neuroscientists actually think that it's not really plausible that we'll ever be able to explain something like perception, something like the interior life of man, something like consciousness in terms of matter alone.
Sure, and we're speaking very generally here, so we're obviously kind of an umbrella of neuroscientists, but we're talking about neuroscientists that are extreme in their views, particularly taking on this materialistic view. He has this last section, which I do think is important.
Yeah, you can read that.
So it's the primacy of mind that he emphasized here, and I've now lost the title.
Yeah, you can. I think that paragraph is helpful.
I want to read this paragraph again. And again, I hope you're following us and you're liking, because I think he does a good job of laying out kind of the ideas we would explain far less more articulate.
Succinctly, yeah.
Okay, despite theoretical claims to the contrary, neuroscience does not account for a person's interior life in terms of matter alone. Okay, we've said that time and time again. No researcher begins with neurons, neurotransmitters, and action potentials, and then explains how sensation and emotions arise from these basic elements. Furthermore, the interior life of a person is not open to observation.
And that's important too. So when you're trying to understand what's going on in someone's brain and like the emotions that they're experiencing, you actually can't just look at a brain scan.
No.
You have to know, based on what that person tells you, what they're experiencing, and then correlate it to what you see on the brain scan.
Right. Instead, neuroscientists in practice take perceiving, feeling, thinking, and willing as primary, and then attempt to correlate brain activity with what the human subject reports. The chemical and electrical activity in the brain is understood in terms of the interior life of the human being. In practice, neuroscience affirms that the mind is primary, not matter. The mantra, chanted daily by many neuroscientists and certain philosophers, the brain is the mind. And that a view of the soul is a hopeless way of thinking.
Right. Basically, he says that mantra is vain. Right. It's a hopeless way of thinking.
Right. And so again, this is kind of what we reiterate time and time again. Let's put that old thing aside and let's focus on the newest scientific discovery in order to try to explain consciousness perception.
Okay. So now that we've we've underlined some of the problems with a theory of materialism, especially as it relates to the human person. Let's talk about briefly, to conclude, what are some of the negative consequences like we've alluded to them already, but like of a materialistic mindset, and then what is the beauty of what the church proposes about man, right? So what would we say to that?
The first and foremost thing I think that's important is here, as we've laid out, one, matter does not explain matter. There's to say, the material world assumes, as we read here, I think the last paragraph, assumes certain things that are immaterial in order to explain itself.
Because it's rational, because it's intelligible, right?
Right. We're trying to explain, for example, the composition of a chair through ideas, through conception, and through perception and feelings and correspondence.
Right.
That is not material. Okay, so that's one thing. Two, I think it limits the scope of reality, because we know intimately that I think there's something deep within man that his heart longs for more than just a temporal world and everything that he does. Yeah. And so to take this materialistic approach is to undermine the value of human dignity in a real sense, in a very real sense, and therefore undermining often truth and kind of this philosophical inquiry and the existential questions. But that's not how we live. We don't live in this kind of limited view. We like to have life abundantly, which takes the material world seriously, but is not limited to it.
Yeah, and most of us, I don't know. I think practically speaking, a lot of us live like materialists. I think so I fall into that a lot of the time. I think that's kind of the nature of sin. In one sense, is to turn our mind from spiritual things, to turn our mind from God, and attach them to make our final end created goods, right? Something like pleasure, something like power, something like wealth, right? And actually, the message of the gospel, the message of reason that the church has advocated for over and over again, but that's buttressed and supported and even superseded by the message of the gospel, is that man does not live on bread alone, right? Contrary to what does that mean? Contrary to what Karl Marx thought, you can't just satisfy man fully by optimizing his material conditions, right? You don't save man merely through feeding him bread or giving him money or giving him pleasure. Man is made for transcendence. He's made for truth. He's made for beauty. He's made for goodness. He's made for meaning. And if he doesn't have these things, he'll wither and die. And the materialistic worldview discards all of that and says man is nothing but matter. And in order to make him happy, you just need to
give him more stuff.
Give him more stuff. Yeah. Exactly.
And I think it's also important that to I was talking to one of my buddies earlier today. We were talking, one of the things about COVID that was interesting is that we started noticing that this remote living wasn't sufficient.
Isolated.
Like no matter the best technology, how developed these apps were, how great our mics were, we still wanted books. Book sales went way up.
Yeah.
Right. We wanted community. We wanted to go outside. Okay. And we started noticing that man's made for more.
Yeah.
We wanted to watch good movies. We want to listen to good music.
Yeah.
People started producing a lot of content online.
Yeah.
People started kind of moving in this direction because there's this aspect in man that he's not just made for the material world. There's something really immaterial that longs for goodness, truth, and beauty. And on that point, one of the central Christian and Catholic claims that I think materialism undermines big time is the point of the incarnation.
Talk about it.
The incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ unites divine nature and human nature in the divine person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Thereby adding dignity to creation,
sanctifying
and
it.
materiality,
Yeah.
justifying it in him,
Right.
right? But also showing that that's not it. That matter, as important as it is not it.
It's not ultimate.
No, and that it needs to be united to
God,
the divine, right?
Yeah.
So the soul, the body composite in the person of Jesus Christ. There's this, as we've said, this sacramental unity that's necessary for man to be who he is.
Yeah.
Right. Not this limited view of materialism that avoids this immaterial reality.
The spirit.
Right. The spirit.
Yeah.
But this conjoining as perfectly shown to us by God.
Yeah, and this is important too because we don't want anyone to walk away from this episode thinking, oh, they don't like materialism, so they think the body is bad, right?
No.
That would be Manichaeanism.
No.
That's what St. Augustine fell into before he was a Christian. That's not what the Catholic Church teaches. When God created everything, he looked at everything he had made and he saw that it was very good. That includes the material world.
Right.
And Jesus Christ, by becoming a man, sanctified all of the material creation and elevated it and made it and introduce the new creation, and we await a new heavens and a new earth, and our bodies will one day be glorified. What's problematic with materialism is not that it values matter, it's that it makes matter the only thing that there is.
And thereby actually undermining the materialistic endeavor from its very principle.
How do you mean?
Because if matter is limited to matter, then what's its real significance?
It doesn't mean anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like, then what? Okay, so you die, then what?
Right.
Well, for a lot of them, they wouldn't believe there's
You
an
live,
afterlife.
then what? It's like life doesn't even matter at all.
And then again, you can use people as objects.
Yep.
Right. You can discard people as the extreme example of like communism and like what's it called? Death camps. What word am I thinking here?
The Holocaust.
All these like people, you can just throw them away. Discard
Those were
them.
built upon materialistic ideologies.
Right. And so to use an extreme example there, I mean, they have real consequences.
These ideas have consequences. Yeah.
Deep consequences. And so while we're saying don't be a materialist, we're also saying love matter. Take it serious.
Yeah.
Right? Because in it we'll find the dignified existence, but not only in it.
Right.
In this deep connection between the two. And as you stated, I think ultimately, at least for myself, man doesn't live off bread alone.
Which is the great temptation. This is why that's what the Lord was tempted with when he went into the desert. That's why Satan said, turn these stones into bread.
You're hungry, man.
You're hungry.
Yeah.
Satisfy your material needs. But Jesus, our Lord, knew, man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. Yeah. That we're made for God.
And you will live in the spirit of truth. I will give you life by the spirit of truth.
Right. Whoever comes to me,
I believe in you.
Something about, do not work for the bread that perishes, but for the bread that endures for eternal life. I will give it, the bread I will give to you, you shall eat of it and never be hungry again, or something like that. It's like, what is the real hunger in man? It's hunger for God. It's hunger for union with God.
And with others.
And with exactly.
That's not explainable again through that we've hammered that home, we hope. So as a last remark, at least for me, I just want to say that we're not against, and actually we're very grateful for the sciences and for the hard sciences, as we say. But what we are warning against is maybe you're a commoner, maybe you're a scientist, maybe you are yourself a professional in this field. It's to avoid the materialistic tendency, the rationalistic tendency, this atheistic, deeply tendency that guides this philosophy.
Yeah, be a scientist, but stay within your lane. Don't take scientific conclusions and then oppose upon them philosophical presuppositions, right? Assumptions. Because we need scientists, and they do increase our knowledge of the material world, but that's not our knowledge of reality in its totality.
Right.
I think that was a good episode.
I hope you liked it, guys. I hope you learned a little some. We threw a lot at you, okay? We get it.
We did.
We threw a lot at you, but we hope that you learned something and that you take this philosophical endeavor as serious as we do, and that you're at least growing in some knowledge and appreciation for the truth and ultimately the truth incarnate, Jesus Christ. That's the whole purpose of
That'd be cool.
This thing.
That'd be cool if that happened.
That'd be great, right? And obviously, guys, know of our prayers for you. Joe, any last remarks?
Happy Lent. Keep going.
Happy Lent.
Stay in the desert
That's
with
right.
the Lord. And pray for us as we do the same.
Talking about Lent, cake is not all that matters. Maggie, chocolate is not all that matters.
Maggie, you can do it.
I believe in you.
you.
That's right. So guys, thank you for tuning into this episode of Logos Podcast. We hope you learned a little something and grew closer to our Lord. Always support us and always know of our prayers for you. God bless and peace.
And peace.
God bless and peace.